You know, Paul McCartney, Mr. Bill, Beatle Bill. Take it away, Mark.
Cheers. Alright, so part 2 is all about the conspiracy theory that is known as PID, or Paul is dead. And it concerns the idea that the original Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter that's been playing the public role to this day. That's the very simplistic account of this particular theory, but it goes much, much deeper than this, trust me. You would think that when someone has spent as much time as I have looking into all of this, weeks turn into months, turn into years, and you realise you'll never get that time back in your life, that the whole thing would gradually become crystal clear, all the pieces would come together, and you'd be able to formulate a logical account as to what really happened. Nothing could be further from the truth. I've been looking into this one for years now, and I'm more frigging confused than ever. So anyone looking for any kind of definitive result and account of what happened from me here today is going to be disappointed, sadly. What I am going to do is aggregate a whole load of other researchers' viewpoints on this topic and present a whole bunch of evidence and clues and indicators that have been gathered from lots of different sources, so that you can all take that away with you and you can be as confused as I am. And we can all be confused together. So it really is time that I've spent too much time on this for it to be healthy, let's say. But nevertheless, it does fascinate me, and very clearly there is something afoot here. And one statement that I can make absolutely definitively, and it's about the only one that I can, is there has been more than one individual presented to the general public as Paul McCartney. I'm 100% clear on that. It's not the case that there's this one guy called Paul McCartney, he's been there since day one, and he's here today. There's more to it than that. There's been more than one, whatever the circumstances. So let's look at some of the evidence for this. The conventional conspiracy theory holds that Paul died in 1966 in a terrible car accident. The dates that come up most frequently for this are the 11th of September and the 9th of November in 1966. So these are both renderings of 9/11/66, depending on whether you take the British or the American date format of 9/11. Americans prefer to think it happened on the 9th of November, but most British researchers are stuck on September 11th of 66. Lots of occult significance to that date. So according to the legend, McCartney got into some kind of heated argument with the other Beatles in a recording studio session, and he stormed off in a huff, got into his convertible sports car and sped through the streets of London and was involved in this horrific car accident. The other Beatles were alerted to this, plus Brian Epstein, and they worked very quickly to conceal this fact from the general public because of the traumatic effect that it would have on Beatles fans. And so the story goes that they found a replacement for McCartney, and they trained him up and they changed his appearance and inserted him into the Beatles so that the public would be none the wiser. That seems rather implausible to me in terms of them being able to find somebody so quickly who was prepared to spend, you know, the rest of their life playing that public role. There's a more sinister version of that story, which holds that the accident that McCartney underwent was no spontaneous thing that nobody could have foreseen. It was actually planned for a long period. And there was a preparatory period for the replacement to train up and alter his appearance and prepare to step into the role when the time was right. As I say, this is the conventional myth or legend or lore when it comes to PID. It's not something that I subscribe to myself anymore. I did in the early days of researching this, but I've come to realise that it goes so much deeper. So there are many researchers that have looked into this. Nick Colostrom, who we mentioned earlier, who may be coming up here to do a talk, hopefully at some point. You know, Nick's got into many controversial topics, as you may know. He doesn't shy away from them. And he's tackled the McCartney one. He put out this book called The Life and Death of Paul McCartney, 1942 to 1966. There it is, very plainly. He's stating that the individual we have today is not the original Paul McCartney. This is an interesting newspaper cutting that recently came across my radar. It dates from 1963, and it says, James Paul McCartney, 21 years old, musician, of 24th Lynn Road, Allerton, Liverpool, was fined £25 and disqualified from driving for 12 months at Wallasey today after he admitted exceeding the speed limit along Seabank Road. So this is kind of like a precursor to that story of what happened to McCartney in '66, getting involved in that terrible car accident. Here he is apparently being done for speeding in 1963. What's interesting is that the Beatles had already broken through to public prominence by 1963. They were household names. So you'd think the newspaper article would say Paul McCartney of the Beatles, but they're just naming him as James Paul McCartney, 21 years old. But either way, maybe that indicates that he was fond of speeding, who knows. This picture is said to be the aftermath of a moped accident that Paul underwent on the 26th of December, Boxing Day, 1965. In the Wirral, close to Liverpool. So the story is that he was out on his moped with a couple of friends, and he had this accident, went flying off the moped and mashed up his face, and particularly his lip there. And these are supposed to be the injuries that he sustained. There's all kinds of theories about this. Some researchers who feel that the car crash, if it happened, was no accident, but that it was planned for and pre-arranged, feel that this could have been a warning and a sort of dry run for what was to come. And this was no straightforward moped accident, but Paul was, beaten up or forced off the moped or whatever in this particular incident. There's a researcher by the name of Richard Balducci, who's an astrologer and gets into the occult. He recently appeared on a show of Mike Williams, Sage of Quay, who's done a lot of great research into the McCartney thing. This Richard Balducci guy was talking about the fact that when you look at the dates of this moped accident and the alleged car crash, 26th of December 1965 to 11th of September 1966, it turns out to be exactly 260 days. And he points out that in the Mayan calendar system and the Mayan ancient civilization, their solar year was comprised of 260 days. And so he wonders if there's some significance to the 260-day period between one event and the other, given that, as we've already discovered, the Beatles were up to their necks in occultism and symbolic, ritualistic practices. Now, I've put a picture of a radio in here because I need my visual clues sometimes so I don't forget to talk about things. The radio's not important, but the story is. So I wanted to mention that last year, a very prominent music producer got in touch with me as a result of having read my book, wanting to speak to me about some things. And I went to meet this person. They want to preserve their anonymity, so I'm not going to mention this person's name. I'm not even going to refer to this person as male or female. But this person said to me that they vividly recall in 1966 hearing a radio news report stating that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been involved in a car crash. And according to this person, the report didn't say that he had died, but it just stated that he'd been involved in this car accident. And it was rather like the reports of World Trade Center Building 7 collapsing on 9/11 that we got from Jane Stanley on the BBC News. This one story went out on air and it was never heard of again. It was completely airbrushed from the BBC historical record, and that would appear to be the case with this story, because this person says the news bulletin went out saying Paul McCartney was involved in an accident. Obviously a lot of people were on the edge of their seats wanting to hear more, and this person says there was no follow-up to that. It was just never heard of again. Also last year I was contacted by email by somebody from the United States, and she said that similarly she remembers a story going out on American radio in 1966 stating that Paul McCartney of the Beatles had been involved in a car crash but had been killed. So she states. And she says she stayed by her radio waiting for follow-up reports and nothing further was heard about it. So a couple of interesting incidents to throw into the mix there. The Beatles camp supposedly put in a whole load of symbolic clues pertaining to the death and replacement of Paul, according to the official legend. And one of the most prolific sources, treasure troves of clues to this effect, was the sleeve to the Sgt. Pepper album, released on the 1st of June 1967. This is supposedly loaded with McCartney death clues. So first of all, you've got the new group in the middle there, and you can see McCartney in the blue suit is significantly taller than the other Beatles, which never used to be the case when you would see the groups in a lineup together. You got the excuse me, the original Beatles there in their black suits, looking all forlorn, and they're gazing down at the flower arrangement, saying the Beatles there. And this is clearly a funeral. They're attending a funeral, and that's a grave. It's as if the old Beatles have been laid to rest, and now you've got the second phase, the new version of the Beatles, that are being given new life there in their colourful Sgt. Pepper suits. There's all kinds of other clues in that sleeve as well, including a bloody driving glove over on the right-hand side, next to a doll with blood splatterings on it, and all sorts of other things. Somebody realised a while back that if you place a mirror in the centre of the Sgt. Pepper drum on this sleeve, so there it is in the original, if you place a mirror halfway along to create a mirror image effect of the first half, the top half, it creates an interesting effect. Now, in the centre, you have the figures 1, 1IX, he die. So when you ascribe Roman numerals to these figures, it comes out basically as 911, he die. And between the he and the die, there's an arrow which is pointing up to where Paul is standing. So this supposedly is another cryptic clue that was encoded into the Sgt. Pepper sleeve, which was designed by an artist by the name of Peter Blake, with heavy input from McCartney, reportedly. And another treasure trove of clues is said to be the Abbey Road album, which came out in 1969. And this very much kick-started the Paul is dead rumour in the United States in the fall, no pun intended, of 1969. So on this album sleeve, you've got the four Beatles crossing the road. Again, there's some more black and white duality with the zebra crossing there. And this is supposed to represent, according to researchers, a funeral procession. So you've got John Lennon in white representing the priest. You've got Ringo in a black suit representing a mourner or a pallbearer at a funeral. Pallbearer, another pun. Then there's McCartney in a loose-fitting suit and he's barefoot walking across the zebra crossing, and he's supposed to represent the corpse. And then there's George Harrison in denim, who's supposed to be the gravedigger. And this is supposed to be another clue as to what happened. As I mentioned, the release of Abbey Road really kick-started the rumours in the American public consciousness among the student community. So a whole load of students at various universities dived onto the whole thing. I've just made a note here of the names involved so that I don't forget, because it gets a bit convoluted. But from my book we have this extract. The first known print reference to this rumour came from an article penned by Tim Harper that appeared in the 17th of September 1969 edition of the Times Delphic, coming out of Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. He claims that his article was written for entertainment purposes only, and that he'd got the information from a fellow student named D'Artagnan Brown. So he was charged, Tim Harper, with writing a review of the newly released Abbey Road album. And to spice it up a bit and make it a bit more interesting than a regular album review, he decided to hone in on this rumour that Paul McCartney had died and been replaced back in 1966. And so he's said to have, or by his own admission, he invented a load of clues, such as stating that the individual who'd taken on the part of McCartney was named William Campbell. Anyway, there was a radio show hosted by a presenter called Russ Gibb on a station coming out of Detroit, which was broadcast on the 12th of October 1969, which just happens to be Aleister Crowley's birth date. And this was where a whole load of students phoned in to Russ Gibb, and they told him where all these clues lay in audio recordings of the Beatles, the most famous one being Revolution No. 9, a track from the White Album of 1968, which, if played backwards at the start of it, where you have an announcer repeating the phrase number 9, number 9, number 9. When you play it backwards, it comes out as "Turn me on, dead man." I've got this extract in a minute, and hopefully we can hear it. But anyway, that was the basis of this Russ Gibb radio show. And once this had gone out, other radio stations on other university campuses all over the United States were all over it. And the Paul is dead thing very quickly became a cultural phenomenon, to the point that there were questions being asked of Derek Taylor, who'd come back as the Beatles publicist by that point, and he was having to field all these requests from magazines and radio stations asking if Paul was really dead. And the whole thing just got completely out of hand. Of course, the Beatles camp completely denied it, and they said, you know, it's ridiculous, Paul's still here, nothing's happened to him, everything's fine. But you'd kind of expect them to do that, right, if something had gone on. So 2 days after the Russ Gibb programme, an article entitled "McCartney Dead, New Evidence Brought to Light" was published by the Michigan Daily. A satirical review of the Abbey Road album. Okay, this was credited to Fred LeBour. Okay, sorry, I've got my names mixed up there. It was Fred LeBour who said he had invented all the clues that he'd put into the Abbey Road album review, not Tim Harper. That's why I write these things down, because I get confused. Okay, so I've got a small section of clues which appear to have been embedded into Beatles audio recordings here, pertaining to the idea that Paul died and was replaced. So I hope we can hear these. Again, I'll turn the computer around to try and enhance it as far as possible. This is one of the most famous ones. It comes from Strawberry Fields Forever, which was released in early 1967. And in the play-out groove at the end of the track, if you listen beneath the music, you can hear John Lennon's voice saying what is supposed to be "I buried Paul." But according to fans, he's saying "I buried Paul," and it's, you know, beneath the music, but it's still audible. When he was asked about it in interviews, John Lennon first said he was saying "cranberry sauce," and then in a separate interview he said, "Oh, I was saying I'm very bored." So we got different accounts of what was actually being said there. And if this was just one clue in isolation, we could probably write it off as being unimportant and not worth our attention. But it's very far from the only one. So here's another one. This is the famous "Number 9 becomes Turn Me On, Dead Man." Probably can't hear that. So again, it's probably hard to hear, but that's a direct reversal of this announcer saying "number 9, number 9, number 9." When you play it backwards, it comes out sounding like "Turn Me On, Dead Man." It's certainly what it sounds like to me, and I've done many of these audio reversals myself. So according to fans and researchers, this was those parties that were involved in the replacement subliminally communicating what went on, but doing it in a very veiled, encoded fashion that wouldn't be obvious to everyone, only to the initiated, so to speak. We have some other clues as well. There were two famous Beatles greatest hits albums which were issued in the early 80s. And you had, first of all, the Red Album, which chronicled the years 1962 to 1966. And then you had the Blue Album, which was the latter period from 1967 to 70. But what's happened between these two albums is they've switched Pauls. So here we have McCartney in second position on the Red Album cover. By the time we get the Blue Album, it's a different guy, at least to my eyes. So, like I said at the start, whatever else happened or didn't happen, I certainly accept there's been more than one individual presented to us as Paul McCartney. And we'll get some more into that. So you've got the Red and the Blue Album, as in red and blue lodges of Freemasonry in the Scottish Rite. So this seems to be another indication of Masonic affiliations of the Beatles, in that we have the Red and Blue albums. So what happened to the real Paul, according to these myths and legends? As I mentioned in the first part, Paul McCartney dated an actress by the name of Jane Asher for a period in the 60s, from 1963 through to about 68. And the story is that Jane discovered Paul in bed with another woman in 1968, and that was the end of the relationship. And that paved the way for him to go on and marry Linda Eastman, who became Linda McCartney. But there's a lot more to this strange affiliation with the Asher family than meets the eye, I believe. Here's Paul, or one of them, from about 1963, stepping out with Jane Asher. And here he is a few years on, also with Jane Asher. Do we notice any difference in height here? Quite clearly a different man, I would suggest, whatever else has happened there. This is Peter Asher, sort of one part Ed Sheeran, one part Austin Powers. And he's the brother of Jane Asher. So Peter Asher was one of the co-directors of the Indica Gallery, which was very much tied into the avant-garde scene in London in the 1960s, alongside Barry Miles, John Dunbar, who was the one-time husband of Marianne Faithfull, who was connected to the Rolling Stones, and who was the other guy? Well, it's Peter Asher, and Paul McCartney was involved in the Indica as well. So McCartney had an interest in avant-garde art, and there was also an occult bookshop element of the Indica Gallery as well. And Paul McCartney's business relationship with Peter Asher, Jane's brother, reportedly continues to this day. Peter Asher was best man at the McCartney wedding. Jane and Peter Asher's mother was Margaret Elliott, and she was a music teacher working at Guildhall School of Music and Drama. One of her students there was George Martin, who became the producer for the Beatles. And Margaret Elliott taught George Martin the oboe and various other instruments, so that's where he got his training. Margaret Elliott comes from aristocratic stock. This biography reveals that she was born to the Honourable Edward Grenville Elliott, a younger brother of both 7th and 8th Earls of St Germans, so basically coming out of aristocratic bloodline links. And so her husband was Dr. Richard Asher, and here he is again. Very interesting fellow. Now, he was a doctor who is described in his official biography as a hematologist and an endocrinologist, I believe. But among his various activities, he was very concerned with the effects of hypnosis and deep sleep studies. He reportedly also experimented with LSD. I've heard accounts of him being affiliated with Dr. Stephen Ward, who was a society osteopath and linked to the whole Profumo political scandal of the 1960s, which you might remember from the movie Scandal, which came out in the late 80s. That whole thing was documented there. And according to certain reports, Stephen Ward used to get young patients, primarily young women, who he would hand over to Dr. Asher for experimentation with some of his mind control research. Paul McCartney lived in the Asher household from 1964 to 1966. This was at 57 Wimpole Street in London. It's where the Asher family lived, and Dr. Asher had his medical practice within his house. He worked at the Central Middlesex Hospital on a medical posting, but he suddenly quit his role in 1964 at the point where Paul McCartney moved in to live with the Ashers during the time that he was dating Jane. So there is a suggestion here that Dr. Asher may have been connected in some way to an MK Ultra style mind control research program connected to the British government, and that Paul McCartney was in some way involved in this, and that his relationship with Jane was arranged so as to facilitate this whole scenario. A few months ago, McCartney brought out a video to his song Who Cares from the album Egypt Station, and in it he's portrayed as this ageing doctor who has this clinic, this practice, and this troubled young woman comes to visit him for advice, and to my mind it seems to be a bit of a play out of the previous arrangement with Dr. Richard Asher, where the young McCartney was living in the household. You'll note that we've got this prominent spiral design over in the side of the picture here, which is another trigger when it comes to mind control programming. And this video is all about trauma-based mind control programming. At the start of the video, there's a badge on the doctor's door where he's listed as being Dr. Lorenz, behavioural hypnotist and meteorologist. And this is clearly a reference to this guy, Edward N. Lorenz, who wrote a book called The Essence of Chaos, as in chaos magic or order out of chaos. And here we've got a monarch butterfly in the centre of the image, which is a symbol very much linked to mind control programming. There's a whole division of MK Ultra known as monarch programming, which is very endemic throughout the entertainment industry. According to this mainstream magazine account of the video and the song, it's about anti-bullying. That's the cover story for this. Paul McCartney's new anti-bullying video, Who Cares? They've got to explain what it's all about in some way, right? And try and make it sound vaguely plausible. Interesting that in this still from the video, you've got McCartney and this girl in a car very similar to the one that crops up in the Paul is Dead legend that he's supposed to have sped off in. But elsewhere in the video, we've got some very disturbing scenes. These were chronicled by Vigilant Citizen, which is a great resource for looking at mind control symbolism in pop videos at vigilantcitizen.com. He's done an analysis of this. And you've got all these figures in the black and white duality again, which is mind control triggers. It's harking back to trauma and satanic ritual abuse and all this, and that's going on throughout the video. But anyway, it brings us back to Dr. Asher. And as I say, it wouldn't surprise me if there's some overtones of the Dr. Asher situation being communicated through that video. When it comes to the song Yesterday, which is always touted as Paul McCartney's most famous song, most celebrated, John Lennon's forever going to be associated with Imagine, George Harrison with Something, and Paul McCartney with Yesterday, all these single word titles. So McCartney said in interviews at the time that the melody to Yesterday came to him in a dream. He said he woke up one morning during the time that he was living in the Asher household, and he just had the melody in his head, but he didn't have the words for it. So he started bashing it out on the piano and coming up with some words, and originally he called it Scrambled Eggs, because he didn't know what else to call it. So to the tune of Yesterday, he was singing Scrambled Eggs, and then he got the lyrics together, but he says he doesn't know where it came from. He just woke up and it was in his head. And apparently he played the tune to friends because he was concerned that he might have plagiarised the song from somebody else. He might have heard it somewhere and it wasn't really his song. And he wanted to get reassurance from his friends that they'd never heard this song before. And they all said, no, this is a new song. According to a blogger by the name of Redwell Trabant, which has to be an anagram, I haven't worked out what it's an anagram of, but there are other researchers as well who go along with this theory. Dr. Asher being involved with hypnosis and deep sleep programming people in deep sleep states with subliminal influences, could well have implanted the melody to Yesterday in McCartney's mind without his conscious knowledge, particularly bearing in mind that Jane Asher's mother, Margaret Elliott, was an accomplished music teacher and musicologist who had trained George Martin. The idea is that maybe as some kind of mind control experiment to see if it could be achieved, the tune to Yesterday was implanted into McCartney's mind as he slept, and then the song was effectively gifted to him. Very interesting alternative origins to Yesterday. And it's also very intriguing to me that next month we've got a new movie coming out which is going to be called Yesterday. It's going to be directed by Danny Boyle. It's written by Richard Curtis. I can't bloody stand Richard Curtis movies, but I suppose I'm going to have to go and see this one just in the name of research. Richard Curtis married to Emma Freud, incidentally, who was the daughter of Sir Clement Freud, who was outed last year posthumously as having been a prolific paedophile. I'm sure that's just a coincidence and nothing to worry about. Then you've got James Corden, OBE, in this film, who appeared with McCartney in Carpool Karaoke recently. And you've got Ed Sheeran, who's also a part of the establishment furniture. So this film is a proper lovey fest of British establishment types, you know, but nevertheless I'm going to have to go and see it. And I know the basic premise of the movie, which is this young up-and-coming musician, played by Himesh Patel, gets hit by a truck and he gets knocked unconscious, and when he comes to, He seems to have gone into this sort of parallel universe, alternative existence, where nobody around him can remember the Beatles. Nobody knows who they were. So he's playing Yesterday on his guitar with a group of friends, and they're all saying, that's amazing. When did you write that? And he says, I didn't write it, Paul McCartney did. And they say, well, who's Paul McCartney? Who were the Beatles? Never heard of them. So he goes through the film plagiarising Beatles songs and passing them off as his own. So there's some very interesting themes here, particularly around that specific song, Yesterday, perhaps having not been written by the person we always thought it was. And the idea of Beatles songs being plagiarised and passed off by other people. Very interesting that these themes are cropping up in this movie, and it's being released at this time. And it's got all those tried and trusted establishment types behind it. What the hell is that? Empty one, okay. Oh no, that didn't work. Okay, I really want to play this if I can get it, because I went to great lengths to prepare this piece of video, and for some reason it's not there. But I do really want to play it because it's so telling.
I want my money back, mate.
You what?
I want my money back if you can't pay it.
No, I've got it here. Right, hold tight, because it's going to...
No pressure.
Exactly. There's no way I'm not going to show this, because somebody brought it to my attention in the week, and it's amazing. What I'm probably going to have to do is just show you off the laptop here, okay, because it's not going to come through on the screen. Right, just temporarily watch the screen. So this is a recording from the Ed Sullivan show in 1965. It's not the original Ed Sullivan appearance, which was 64. This is when they returned to it. During the performance, we have McCartney doing the song Yesterday. This is the tail end of his performance of Yesterday. You've got to listen very closely to what John Lennon says when he finishes performing the song, after the crowd has applauded. Did you catch it?
Yeah.
He says, "Thank you, Paul, that was just like him." That's a strange thing to say, isn't it?
It is.
It really is. That's a piece of gold, that is. And interestingly, you've got the whole performance from Ed Sullivan 1965, which is available on YouTube, but when you go and search for that bit, it's been faded out. You can't find it. I got that off a Russian site, which is the only place you can get the video intact. Somebody has seen to it that that bit doesn't appear in the version that's on YouTube. So let's go back to the presentation now. Right, we should be back where we need to be. And the next one is another piece of video. Or I hoped it was video. Yeah, this is another one that's been scrubbed from YouTube as well, actually. I got put onto this a few years ago. It's a Beatles press conference from 1966 in the wake of the release of their album Revolver. And they're being asked questions. And somebody asked the question, have the Beatles ever used doubles or decoys? And John Lennon makes a cryptic comment again in response to this question. He says, sometimes you can't tell the would-be's from the real thing. And he's looking over in Paul's direction when he says it. This is something that has also been erased from YouTube. So you get the press conference, but that piece has disappeared from it. And I got this from Tina Foster's Plastic Maca blog site. She's documented the whole thing in an article which she posted several years ago. And she's going through the video frame by frame saying, you know, this is said at this point, this is said at this point. And right there in the blog she says, at the 14-minute mark in this video, you hear John saying, sometimes you can't tell the would-be's from the real thing. But when you go to the video that's embedded, it's now disappeared. So somebody's been into that video on YouTube and erased that piece, so you can no longer get it. But I can assure you that it was originally there, and that's what John said in response to the question. So we're getting all these little clues the whole time. There's another one here. The audio is very low, so I'll tell you what he says. But basically, this is a Paul McCartney interview from 1964 on David Frost. It's too low to hear, but basically, Frost says, "What's next for you? What do you want to achieve?" And McCartney jokes, "Oh, I want to retire." And Frost says, "Well, you know, when do you hope to achieve that?" And McCartney says, "Well, the way things are going, a couple of years." 1964. There's a still from the TV appearance. He seems to feel the need to flash up that sign spontaneously. All right, so there is one candidate who is very frequently cited as having been the individual that replaced Paul McCartney, if we accept that the original was indeed taken out. And that is an individual that goes by the name of William Shepherd, known colloquially as Billy Shears. In the opening track to the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967, it ends with them saying, "May I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears." So it's like that whole album is celebrating the introduction of this individual. And when we see McCartney in the blue suit on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, supposedly that's the announcement of Billy Shears having come on the scene. Paul is gone and William is now here. A couple of incredible books that anyone really researching this whole subject area should look into. The Memoirs of Billy Shears. The original version of this came out on the 9th of September 2009. So it's 999, or if you flip it round, 666. This book purports to be the individual that took over playing the public role of Paul McCartney, who goes by the name of William Shepherd, spilling the beans and telling everyone what happened and how it was done. And according to the account in this book, which was written through an author or an encoder known as Thomas Hugh Harriot, he states that Paul was getting these terrifying premonitions of his own death. He was getting these really horrific nightmares in the months leading up to 1966. And he told his bandmates about them, but they all just dismissed it and fobbed it off and said it's nothing. But he seemed to be getting these visions of his own death, according to this book. And it did indeed come to pass on the 11th of September 1966 in this terrible car crash. And he, Billy, who states that his real name is William Shepherd, he says he's descended from William Wallace, who was the Scottish nobleman turned freedom fighter who was portrayed by Mel Gibson in the movie Braveheart. He claims to be descended from him. He also hints that there's a family connection in there somewhere to Aleister Crowley, who died in 1947. William says he was born in 1937, so he's 5 years older than the original Paul McCartney, who was born in 42. So he states that he comes from a Freemasonic family. He received musical training from a very young age, so he became very proficient as a performer and a musician. And it was always on the cards that he would be inserted into popular culture in some way so as to have an influential effect. And he says that when Paul died in '66, that was his cue to step into that role and pass himself off as Paul McCartney, playing that public role. There was an updated version of this book, the 9 after 909 edition, which came out on the 9th of September 2018, last year. So it's 9918. 999, 3 more nines, and we have the blue version of the book versus the red version of the book, so it's like going back to the Beatles' Greatest Hits album, the red and blue lodges of Freemasonry. We get some new revelations in this book coming through Hugh Harriot, who has written the book in layered coding. So you can read it as a straightforward book from cover to cover, but there's also 2 sets of coding in there. You get certain words and phrases in bold, and if you just concentrate on reading the words that are in bold print, you get another narrative of the story being told. And there's also an acrostical code where you can put together phrases from words in terms of where they're placed in the paragraphs. And there's a whole new narrative of the book that can be read and understood that way. So Hugh Harriot would appear to be a Freemason himself. Mike Williams, the Sage of Quay, who, as I say, has done some incredible research into this subject area, has been in contact with Hugh Harriot many times and had conversations with him, and Hugh Harriot's given him lots of inside information about what went into the writing of this book. So in this new version, through the author's notes, we hear that William, Billy, was subject to mind control programming, satanic ritual abuse, from the age of 3, which is something that seems to happen a lot in the entertainment industry, particularly when it comes to prominent bloodlines, certain families. The individuals coming through these families that are going to be put into future influential roles in their adult life are subjected to trauma-based mind control at a very early age to shatter their personality and make them programmable so that they basically stick with what's been laid out for them to do. So these are all revelations that we get from Memoirs. It details the week following the 11th of September 66, when Paul is said to have died in a car crash, in very great detail. How the news was broken to the other Beatles, what the reactions were and such. It goes into the lyrics of many famous Beatles songs and tells you what they're really communicating. When you get beneath the surface, there's all kinds of encoded meanings into famous Beatles songs. And it certainly seems to come with a lot of inside knowledge from somebody that would have to have been inside the Beatles' inner circle to have known all this stuff. It certainly has that air of plausibility about it to me. Many people, of course, claim that it's a hoax, that it's faked, that it's just complete fiction. It is presented as historical fiction. So, on several occasions, the author makes it very clear that it's a work of historical fiction. And it has to be presented that way, because if it was being put out there as fact, by now, the author and the publisher and everyone else involved in this book would be up to their neck in lawsuits from various people because of the many breaches of copyright and identity theft and all of this that were involved in this story. But by passing it off as historical fiction, there's plausible deniability involved. So if ever they were called upon to answer for a certain revelation that's made in the book, they could say, oh, well, that's just fiction, you know, we made it clear that that's what this book is. But nevertheless, there seems to be a lot of truth being communicated through this. When it comes to evidence for the individual that we thought of as Paul McCartney really being called Billy or William, there are many examples of this, and I've got a few in video format here. First off, we have a little clue going back to the Strawberry Fields video once again. I'll put it up here so you can hear the sound. So this is an extract from the video for Strawberry Fields Forever, and pay special attention to what comes on screen during the first lyric, "Nothing is real." Very strange video. Living is easy with eyes closed, misunderstanding all you see. And then at the point where we get "Nothing is real," you get an image of McCartney, of course. Let's look at some other Billy clues and some other indicators that this might not actually be the original McCartney. So here's the first one.
Suddenly realised that I didn't actually know how to set up a band. You think about it, I'd never actually done it before. I joined the Beatles as an already set up affair.
So he seems to have a really bad memory and to forget certain key details in interviews. In other interviews that he's given, he stated that he had a couple of jobs before he joined the Beatles, whereas the official record of things has it that McCartney joined the band straight out of school, and it's the only job he's ever had. And in this interview he says, I joined the Beatles an already set up affair, which is not what the official record states. The official record states that John formed the band with Paul, they brought in George and Stuart and Pete, kicked out Pete, brought in Ringo, but Paul was one of the original members. And here he is saying, I've never, set up a group from scratch. And he misremembers so many things. He's got a very vague memory. He was asked in one interview, a question and answer session, where a particular Wings jacket came from. Somebody had seen him wearing a Wings jacket. And he's like, oh, I don't know, I think it was sometime in the 1970s. So he's narrowed it down to a 10-year period. It's very specific. So he seems to forget himself a lot. So here's the next one.
At the beginning, when I joined, Paul was the only one who would sleep with me.
Well, there was actually a little bit of a thing to that. I was never very prejudiced. No, I thought that was the best move, really, because when you joined and you were like the new fella, and everybody, and I thought, well, if I hang out with you, then they'll all be like, So I thought it'd be good to
Put Paul with it.
yes, because then it would be all right. Then. Yeah, it
So
would,
anyway,
because
but then it changed. It would be with anybody. I mean, for a while we was John and I was in.
Right, so he's saying, when you joined and you were the new fella, and he's beckoning towards Paul when he says that. He's talking about him being brought in as the new guy in the band. And it was the other way around. George was brought in by John and Paul when they were already in place. So that seems to be another alternative account of things. And we have this one.
nice to see you.
Paul walks into a room. George says, "Hello, William."
Vegetarian leather jacket. Yes. That's the one I can see. Can't turn it off. I can see. I don't want to turn it off. I've seen that sharp. I've seen that.
He doesn't seem too happy at realising he's being filmed after he's just been called William. Here's another one. This is from Give My Regards to Broad Street, Paul McCartney movie from 1984. He walks into a room, somebody says, "Do you know William?" We've got another instance of him being called William. His character name in the movie was not William. This one?
We all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all love Paul very much.
So it's George Harrison when the Beatles are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. George attends with Ringo. McCartney doesn't turn up to this one for some reason. And George gives the speech and he says, "I'm afraid this is all that's left of the Beatles," meaning him and Ringo. Which is a strange thing to say if Paul's out there somewhere, right? And then he says, "We all loved John," and what sounds like to my ears, we all loved Paul very much. Some people will insist he's saying we all love Paul very much, but it sounds to me like he's saying we all loved. Sounds like another clue. Then, these are two outtakes from the Imagine movie, which accompanied Lennon's album in '71.
The Beatles, no, I did see Big Lad though recently. It's doing quite well in Sweden, I believe. Number five.
And we will hear it, or is it screen?
Is that yes. On the team? Yes. Fairly fresh. This is actually a Beatle-wide fixing the tea for one of the Bad 4 ex-Beatle Bad 3 and such.
And I got my wife here. It's my wife.
Yeah, I'm Beatle-wide on the baby. See Beatle Bill making a pig of himself. He likes his, whatever it's called.
So I see you like...
Alright, so this is from the Imagine movie. It was released on video in 1988, which is the first time anyone saw this footage. But you got George and John sitting around the kitchen, and they make a reference to the Fab Four, and then George corrects him and says the Fab Three. And John goes, "Oh yeah, the Fab Three." And then they start talking about a Beatle Bill, whoever that may be, and a Beatle Ed. Nobody knows who Beatle Ed is. But you assume that this is a spontaneous scene that just happened to be captured during the making of the film, and they're just horsing around, and that's what came out of it. But somebody discovered recently that there is another take of that scene, which didn't make the final cut of the movie. So it was filmed again, which means it wasn't some spontaneous off-the-cuff thing. It was meant to be in there, these references to Beatle Ed and the Fab 3. So in the next cut, you'll see that everything's rearranged and they're saying things in a different order. It's another take of the same scene.
Yes.
Yes.
Fairly British. This is actually a Beatle wife fixing the tea for one of the Fab 4 ex-Beatle. Fab 3. See Beatle Bill making a pig of himself. See much of the Beatles these days. Beatles are great power. Beatle Ed. Beatle Ed Halladay. He was alright, but he was just going off on a tour. Beatle Ed's not doing so well these days, is he? Well, he's number 5 in Sweden. Oh, in Sweden, that's it.
So you see in one version of this scene, it's Beatle Bill who's number 5 in Sweden, and then in the other version it's Beatle Ed who's number 5 in Sweden, so they're interchanging the two. But either way, it was obviously deemed important to get this stuff out there, and then you get the little wink from Lennon at the end as if we're being let in on a secret. Right, what's next? Let's play that one again. This is a rare outtake from the recording of Let It Be. There is still a chance, Bill. People have said that during the recording of the Let It Be album, Billy Preston, the American musician, was present in the sessions, and that could be a reference to him. I guess it could, but either way it's a strange thing for him to insert in there. I will concede that could be what is the case there, but this is far from the only clue that we have, right? It's just added to the glut. Another one? Classic?
It's kind of like...
No. This is Denny Laine, who was in the group Wings with McCartney.
What was the life playing with Billy Shepherd instead of fucking Paul McCartney? I don't know. That's all you're going to say, my friend. The one and only Billy Shepherd. Sir, it was an honor to play with you. Can I get a picture, maybe? Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, can you cut that?
Last bit. Right, so that's Denny Laine, who was a part of the group Wings with McCartney. He was also in the group The Diplomats in the very early 1960s, and according to the group The Memoirs of Billy Shears, William Shepherd, in one of his previous pseudonyms as Phil Ackrell, was also a part of the group The Diplomats. So he played with Denny Laine back in the 60s, and then when he formed Wings in the 70s, he brought his old mate Denny Laine into that lineup. This was from a couple of years ago. Obviously Denny and the interviewer are pretty pissed. They've had a drink or two, you know. They're arsing around. But it's very telling that the interviewer says, I've been plucking up the courage to ask you this, you know, what was it like playing with Billy Shepherd in Wings? And look at Denny Laine's reaction instantly. He turns around, you know, he's got his attention straight away. And he kind of denies it, but he doesn't. He says, who the hell's Billy Shepherd? It's Billy Shears. So he's confirming it, but he's not. It's like masterful speaking, which we're going to get onto shortly. And it comes with plausible deniability. So if ever he was challenged on it, he could say, oh, I was just playing along, you know, I've heard this rumour about Billy Shears. But he's kind of half confirming it. And then at the end he says, who the hell's Billy Campbell anyway? Because we get these two names for the replacement. Sometimes it's William Shepherd, sometimes it's William Campbell. Interestingly, there is a William Campbell in the group Marmalade, who had a hit with Obla-Dee Obla-Da, a Beatles song in the 1960s. He's known as Junior Campbell. Wings had a song called Junior's Farm in the 70s, which could have been a reference to him. But that's a real-life William Campbell, who is connected to the Beatles and seems to have been mixed up in this whole story. Now the next one is great. I hope you can hear this. This is a pretty damning piece of evidence, in my opinion.
Like when I met Paul McCartney, I never even been on Saturday Night Live. I was hanging out more by his house, and I had the presence of mind
So I said, I talked about his album 1980 and the song Tug of War, and I said, you know that lyric in the chorus, one day we'll stand up on top of the mountain with our flag unfurled, but it won't be soon enough. And he just lit up. He just lit up. Oh, that was a song, you know, I thought it was because of a big flag, you know, on top of the mountain. You know. And then that was it. That was it. We were fast friends after that. So I think with Billy, people like it. If you take one of his obscure songs or obscure album and be very specific about the lyric that he wrote, people love that.
I mean, that could be clue number one in my book. He's telling this anecdote about meeting Paul McCartney. He's quite clearly talking about Paul McCartney and his music. And then in the next breath he says, I think with Billy, and he's still talking about the same guy. Why is he calling him Billy? It's not on public record anywhere that Paul McCartney was ever nicknamed Billy. So why should all these references to Billy be in place? And here's another one. George Harrison's son. The spit of him.
Hello, Billy.
That's Olivia, George Harrison's wife. Quite clearly to my ears, greeting him as Hello Billy. All the Billy clues. And finally, Heathergate.
Oh.
She's from around here, isn't she?
Was she? Yeah.
You know why I've left you. Protect me, and I will say nothing. Something so awful happened. Someone I'd loved for a long time, I found out had betrayed me immensely, and I don't mean infidelity or anything like that, like beyond belief.
So somebody betrayed you, and of course everyone here is going to believe that that's Paul McCartney. In a way, not infidelity. That is so much deeper than that. It wounded you and pushed you towards suicide.
Yeah, it did. And he knows that.
So it's Paul.
But I've got to protect myself. I have to protect myself. People don't want to know what the truth is because they could never, ever handle it. They would be too devastated.
Popular girl, is she, Heather?
She got 22 million. Fee off.
Did all right out of it.
Yeah.
So there she was giving these television interviews in 2007 talking about having discovered a terrible secret. Somebody having betrayed her beyond belief, and the public would never be able to handle the truth if it got out. She's not talking about infidelity. She said she had a box of evidence that was being safely stashed with somebody, so if anything happened to her, the truth would come out. So she says, you'd better protect me, speaking to the camera. So someone who's very scared, and someone who's discovered something devastating, and somebody who hasn't said a bloody word about it from 2007 to this day. So she's either been scared to death to not talk about it, or paid off with a very handsome sum to keep it zipped. And like I say, nothing has been heard about her further. So what could she have been talking about? You know, everything that she mentioned in those interviews is very consistent with the idea of Paul McCartney not being who we think he is.
You know, just to say, remember there's an interview on TV where she said, I've been used to travelling first class and da-di-da-di-da and the best flights and everything else, and I'm not going to give that up.
Right.
Having said that, I'm sure she'd rather just not have the secret.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to be carrying a secret like that for money.
She's quite lucky not to have undergone an overdose or committed suicide or had a car accident by now, I would suggest. Not to say it won't ever happen, of course. Here's another clue then. We've got Paul/Billy standing next to a sign where you got the name Billy right next to his head. And if you look at his hand in his pocket, he appears to be doing some kind of hand sign. Masterful speaking. So this comes from Mike Williams, Sage Aquay, good friend of mine. I've done many shows with him. He's really delved into the whole McCartney thing. He's bringing it back to the idea that the Beatles' backstory is steeped in links to Freemasonry, and that Billy, Paul himself, may well be and probably is a Freemason. So there's an element of this which is masterful speaking. And when Masons reach a certain level in the hierarchy, they are permitted to divulge certain information through masterful speaking. So they're telling you things, but they're doing it in encoded cryptic form, so that, again, there's plausible deniability involved. So they can always deny that's what they were saying if they were called upon it. But nevertheless, as they see it, they're adhering to their tenet of placing the truth in plain sight and revelation of the method, and giving us profane ones the opportunity to understand a situation so we can never make the claim that we weren't told. It's them shifting the onus for a situation onto us and shifting the karmic responsibility away from them onto us as they see it, by being able to make the claim that they gave us the chance to know. And if we're too dumb and ignorant and profane to understand what's being communicated, that's on us and not on them. So here's an example that Mike has highlighted, where Paul picks up an award, Companion of Honour for Contribution to the Arts. And in his acceptance speech he says, "I see this as a huge honour for me and my family, and I think of how proud my Liverpool mum and dad would have been to see this." Which is a bit of a strange thing to say, isn't it? Why not just say, my mum and dad? It's as if he's trying really hard to convince everyone that he's who he says he is. This hasn't loaded either, annoyingly. But I can tell you what it is. It's an excerpt from the Letterman chat show that McCartney appeared on in 2009. And David Letterman and McCartney are having a good old laugh about the Paul is dead rumour. And Letterman brings it up. And he says, you know, of course there was this rumour that you died, and it was all started by the Abbey Road sleeve. And McCartney says, oh yeah, you know, I was walking across, it was very hot that day, and I turned up in flip-flops, you know, like sandals, and I kicked him off and walked across the road barefoot, and because of that, it's like he's dead. I didn't see it myself. And he's just really making the whole thing sound simplistic and ridiculous. And then Letterman says, oh, and the other part of it was that there's this guy that's been taking on the public role and impersonating you for all these years. And McCartney goes, yeah, well, this is him. And they all have a good old laugh about it. So in that phrase, he's telling you that he's not Paul, and he's telling you he's the guy that replaced him, but he's doing it in a jovial, jokey kind of fashion, which comes with plausible deniability attached. So that if anyone challenged him further on it, he could say, oh, come on, it's obvious I was just playing along with Letterman and just doing it for laughs, you know. So that's masterful speaking, telling you without really telling you. And there are many examples of this. So many McCartneys, this is the theory that we're not looking at a straight individual switch out here. It's not the case that one guy has been replaced by another, there are more than two. If your brain's not properly scrambled yet, it will be by the end of this, trust me. Many McCartneys. This is an image that's often used by Tina Foster, who runs the Plastic Maca blog site, which is a very comprehensive resource of evidence for a McCartney switch. She often uses these photos side by side. So if you showed any regular member of the public, average Joe in the street, one of these pictures and said, who is this? They're going to say to you, well, it's Paul McCartney. But it's not until you put them side by side that you see the differences between the two faces. And to my mind, these can't possibly be the same person. But it doesn't just stop there. This is a montage that was put together again by Mike Williams, Sage of Quay, and it's of many different McCartneys that have been presented to us over the years. Again, you look at any one of these in isolation and you don't think there's anything wrong with it, but you put them side by side and the anomalies all start to stack up. So the picture in number 1 is generally taken to be the original biological Paul McCartney. And then you contrast that with number 2, which looks like a different guy. Number 3, which is the individual thought of as Billy Shears. Number 4 appeared in an interview talking about LSD in the 60s, appears to be different to number 1, could possibly be the same as number 3. Number 5 looks more like Sylvester Bloody Stallone to me. Number 6 doesn't look too much like any of the others. Number 7 is a Wings era McCartney. Number 8, again, doesn't look like any of the others. Could be a part-time impersonator.
Number 5 looks like that guy off the Lightly Lads.
Oh, Rodney Hughes. Yeah, he does a bit. He does a bit. There's all these Geordie connections to this. Then here's another montage. Number 1, again, thought of as biological Paul. Number 2, a classic early picture of McCartney in Hamburg in 1960, taken by a German photographer called Astrid Kircher, from a very fated photo set of Lennon and McCartney. Now, we'll get a bit more onto that one in the next section. Then we have number 3, looking different again, and just compare and contrast all these different faces. Are we looking at different pictures of the same man, even allowing for ageing, or are there different individuals being portrayed here? Certainly, looking at number 1 and number 2, just as a show of hands, is there anyone in here that accepts that can be the same person? No one, right? I did this in Birmingham on Tuesday, and 2 people put their hands up and thought it was the same, but that was in a room full of about 80. Okay, so we're all agreed, number 1 and number 2 at least are different people, right? Certainly are in my book.
Number 8 is Hugh Grant, isn't it?
Number 8 isn't him at all.
I don't know who that is.
Spectators.
So, Mike's theory is that there have been 2 full-time replacements, which is why we see so many discrepancies. It's not the case that you just had William Shepherd, Billy Shears stepping into the role. He has predominantly played the public role of Paul McCartney, and he's played the musician side of it. So he's probably the guy that we see in performances and that we've had in the studio creating the songs. But Mike is of the view that there's also a kind of public relations, what he calls street Paul, which is another player who does interviews, public appearances, is seen out and about when the other one is too busy, presumably. And we're having a massive mind control, psyop, mindfuck placed on us by having 2 full-time replacements, plus probably the odd part-timer that steps in as well to do a photo shoot here, a public appearance there. Just imagine if that is really the case, the logistics that would have been involved in that kind of situation. And it could only have happened with the full complicity of military intelligence, right? There's no way a small circle of Beatles associates could have pulled this off themselves as a little trick or a little prank. It would have been rumbled by now, it would have been discovered. So it absolutely hints at the full complicity of the intelligence services, particularly when you consider that McCartney was knighted by the Queen in 1997. And there's no way an imposter could have slipped through the net and get to meet the Queen unless it was intended to happen, because they would have been discovered through the background checks that are supposed to go on through MI5 and MI6 to anyone that comes into contact with the royal family. So it all smacks of being coordinated to the highest level. In McCartney's own videos, we seem to have had the psyop played out, because we've had different Pauls in the same video, and we've had all these references to alternative identities and disguises. This is from the wonderful Christmas Time video from 1979, and you have 2 Pauls. When you watch the video, you think it's just a mirror image of Paul. But when you study the noses and the facial structure and stuff, you realise it's actually 2 Pauls in the same video. Then you have the video to the song Coming Up, 1980. He plays multiple roles in it. So he plays all these different members of the band, and he appears in disguise. It's like rubbing your nose in it, letting you know that there's alternative identities going on here. In the Pipes of Peace video, he plays a British soldier and a German soldier coming face to face in the trenches of World War I. So he's playing 2 roles in the same video there. He's in disguise. He's in disguise in the Spies Like Us video, Spies Like Us, where he's got this Prince Charles face mask and he rips it off, and underneath you see it's McCartney, disguises again. Here's another little montage that I put together. The first picture is from the video to Hey Jude, which is dated September 1968. This is January 1969 for the Let It Be recording sessions and the famous rooftop jam on the rooftop of EMI's Abbey Road studios, Savile Row Studios. January 69, so there's 4 months between those 2. We're supposed to believe he's grown a full beard and grown his hair to that degree, plus changed the hair colour, plus changed the eye colour in the space of 4 months. I mean, again, does anyone here accept that could possibly be the same person?
Take me 4 years to grow a beard like that.
Exactly. I don't think you could grow a beard like that in 4 months.
Different nose shape.
So, different individuals. It should have been so obvious back then, in 68 and 69, but the general public on the whole didn't seem to notice.
Everyone was on acid.
Somebody has been emailing me a whole load of picture comparisons of Paul. This person has really delved into this area of research. She doesn't want to be named, so I'll respect that, but I'm going to show some of the stuff that she sent. She is of the view that there were 2 Pauls put out there during the 1964 US tour. That's one of them. And that's the other, second in there. So, certainly seems to be 2 completely different individuals to me. The heights, again, are very different. And that's on the same tour. He does look younger, yeah. Then we have this Paul with the beard, who appeared during the filming of the movie Let It Be, filmed in January 1969. Then there's another picture from the same movie filming, where you get Paul and the beard appears to be missing. Now it's very annoying that he's got his bloody arm in the place of where his beard should be, but you can see the whiskers stop just below the ear, and there's a break there, so it's not continuing into a beard. So I think if the arm wasn't there, we'd see that he's not actually wearing a beard. So you could make the case that between the first picture and the second, he shaved the beard off, of course. But there are people that have studied the pictures and the footage from Let It Be, and they believe there's 2 Pauls being shown to us there as well. Then we have Paul with Ringo, a young version from the 60s where he's towering above him, and then a latter day Paul and Ringo where Paul appears much shorter. So possibly a different guy. These are the official heights of the Beatles from one of the fanzines, one of the official Beatles fan club publications of the time. And it lists the heights of John, Paul and George as all being 5'11", and Ringo is shorter at 5'8". So that's the official line on how tall they all were. There's another theory that what we've been looking at all these years is actually twins. And the best kept secret of all, with the public being the last to know, is that Paul McCartney was one of fraternal twins. There's a researcher by the name of Miles Mathis who has put out a paper to this effect, and he's put forward this theory. This is what purports to be a childhood picture of the twin boys, according to Mathis. The official story is that Paul has a brother by the name of Mike McCartney, professionally known as Mike McGear. He was part of the group The Scaffold. He looks absolutely nothing like him, but we're told that he's his younger brother. So according to Mathis, we've had twins all these years, and there's other researchers that buy into that as well. There was an album put out by McCartney in the 90s called Twin Freaks, interestingly. And there's Mary and Jim McCartney, Paul's parents, with what purports to be 2 boys. There they are again. And there's Paul with Mike. As I say, no family resemblance there at all, really. So, I don't know. It's possible, I guess, that we could have been looking at twins. There's no verifiable documentary evidence as far as I'm concerned. You know, Mathis and others are pretty much speculating and just putting forward a theory that this is the case, and I don't think there's anything to actually prove that that's what happened. But either way, the confusion continues. So we move on to the possibility that the real Paul never died, because again, there's no documentary evidence that he died. We've got those 2 anecdotes that I mentioned earlier from people that say they recall radio broadcasts saying he was involved in an accident. Only got their word for it. I'm not saying I doubt them, but I'm just saying it's not verifiable beyond their word. So the idea that the real Paul has always been around, and maybe still is. Let's look at some evidence for that. The same person that emailed me those pictures from the 1964 tour has given me a whole load of comparisons that she claims show the same individual decades apart. So she would tell you that this is the same guy in the 60s and in the 90s. She claims this is the same guy. Plus this. A few similarities there, I'd say. This. it's definitely the case that you can go Paul blind. You can look at these pictures so much, they all just start to merge into each other, and you get more and more confused, and you just have to remove yourself from the situation. Loads of other people have told me that as well. It's not just me that experiences it. Paul blindness comes with this research. And then she points to this TV interview from the 1960s and his seated posture, and the way that he's striking a very similar posture decades later on another chat show as an indication that it's the same guy. And then just the final head scramble of them all, just to make sure I've covered all bases. The idea that the person we think of as the real Paul McCartney may in fact be the imposter, the odd guy, the cuckoo in the nest. So this is McCartney in a 1966 press conference in LA, and this is the individual that most researchers will tell you is the real Paul. This is who everyone thinks of as biological Paul McCartney. So there he is again from the same interview. Now we put it side by side with this 1960 picture from Hamburg taken by Astrid Kircher, and they look very, very different. But to my eyes, the individual in the first picture from 1960 bears more of a similarity to the present day McCartney and the one that we're most familiar with than the second one, which raises the possibility that this is the original real Paul, and he's still around now, but that this guy is not Paul, and he was inserted into the story for a period, for whatever reason, as a diversion or whatever, and everyone's fixated on him as being the real Paul, and they've missed the fact that actually he's been around since day one, and he still is.
Which one was they said? Which was the one that said the 64 could be returned to? Yeah, is it him? Earlier you said 64.
You said it was going to retain.
You said 1964 is that we're retiring.
Yeah, well this was 1966, so the one in 1964 said, oh, I'm probably going to retire in a couple of years, but that was a different Paul to that one, and this is 66. So yeah, who knows. So that's another possibility to present there. That is actually the Paul from the 64 interview, contrasted with the 66 one. Different guy, I'd say. Now do you see why I'm confused? I'll just throw this one in. Some of you might be familiar with this, but this is a guy by the name of John Halladay, and he is the caretaker of the childhood home of Paul McCartney in Liverpool. So for a period he used to give tours and look after the home and stuff. And some people seem to think that this could be the real Paul, fallen on very hard times. You know, he was sidelined out of the Beatles, replaced by Billy or whoever, and this is how he wound up as an alcoholic caretaker. He's left that post now. I personally don't go for the theory. I don't think there's enough of a similarity there, and there's nothing beyond speculation and opinion to back up that theory. But I just thought I'd throw it in there because some people seem to go for it. So there he is, whoever he is. Very interestingly, in a piece of artwork to accompany his latest album release, there was a publicity photo consisting of two Pauls, which was put out there. So what relevance there is to that, who can possibly say? And in a recent magazine interview, he's quoted as saying, "I was one of the Beatles. Can you believe it?" So that's pretty much it. I've got a few memes here. I've got a few memes I've created. This one works well in America, of course. This one doesn't work at all in America because nobody knows Fawlty Towers there, but it does tend to work quite well in the UK. And I just want to sum up by saying a lot of people, when they look at this material, believe it or not, will actually say, so what? What does it matter? Who cares if he was replaced? The music's still good.
Can I just mention, you know when there was a German woman had a baby to the original Paul?
Yes, yes.
And then there was a DNA,
Yep.
and it wasn't Paul's DNA.
That's right, yeah.
And that woman swore that it was Paul, so
Yeah.
she believed.
Yeah, that's right.
What did you have to
So
say about
during the Beatles period in Hamburg, when they were playing gigs there, McCartney, the real one presumably, is supposed to have impregnated this German woman who had a daughter, Paul McCartney's daughter. And in later years, in the 1980s, the mother and the daughter wanted to start getting some payments out of McCartney to support the child, because the mother swore blind that McCartney was the biological father. And so they sent off for a DNA paternity test. And when the sample came back, plus the signature on the document, they swore blind that it wasn't McCartney's DNA that had been submitted, and it wasn't his signature on the paper. The original Paul was left-handed, incidentally. And the story goes through the memoirs of Billy Shears that the replacement had to train himself to play the bass left-handed because he was naturally right-handed, and he had to train himself to write left-handed as well. So the German woman, Erika Hubers, Bettina was the name of the daughter, claimed that this showed that McCartney was not who we thought he was. There was also an incident where McCartney was in Japan in 1980 on tour, and he got busted at the airport for having marijuana in his suitcase, and he got thrown in a Tokyo jail for 10 days, I think it was. And he only got out through the intervention of some friends in very high places, like in the British government, that intervened on his behalf and secured his release from the jail. And the reason he got detained by the Japanese was because they said they had a fingerprint sample of him from when the Beatles had previously toured Japan in the 1960s, and the fingerprint that they took from him in 1980 didn't match the one they held on record. So they felt that he was an imposter and it was identity theft, so they chucked him in jail while they sorted out what to do with it. And as I say, there was some intervention from some close friends that rapidly secured his release. So there's a couple of other examples throwing some doubt on this being the same person throughout. So people will say, what does it matter, it's not really important. Got to be kidding, right? You know, one of the most famous people and influential cultural icons in the world can be switched out under our very noses, or at the very least somebody has been inserted in for a period playing that public role, and it's not been him, and we've not been told about it, and people will claim that doesn't matter. You know, it indicates the complicity of military intelligence, and it shows that the public is being lied to and deceived on a monumental scale, and people will claim that doesn't matter. And the whole thing about the Beatles story, if we can show that there's occult influence in there, there's Masonic influence, there's elements of military intelligence, there's elements of state-sponsored mind control, and there's elements of identity theft and, you know, replacements. What does that say about popular culture, that that can all happen with arguably the most influential group of all time? And do we really believe it's going to be just limited to that group? Is it not far more likely that these elements are going to be present throughout the entertainment industry, and not only that, but throughout organised society generally? And the common denominators in all of it are lies and deception, and the general public being mugged off and just being made fools of. That to me is pretty bloody important. And if we can show how these things were done, and we can make people understand that the world is not run by the people we think it is, and it's not the way we've been trained to think of it as, then we're on the road to critical thought, and we're on the road to a different way of viewing things and taking back some of our power and avoiding being mugged off in such a profound way. So I think it is pretty important to get to the bottom of these things, or at least ask the questions. And that's why it astounds me that people don't think this is important. So that's pretty much all I've got to say about it. One final meme, which again doesn't work in America. So I've got books at the back. Volume 1 of Musical Truth covers, there's a big chapter on the Beatles, big chapter on the Rolling Stones, I cover the Laurel Canyon scene, and there's 12,000 words on the McCartney Paul is Dead conspiracy. It's the biggest chapter in the book. And then in Volume 2 I've got another chapter following it up with some new reflections on the whole thing. Other than that, do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. 5 minutes, because I'm aware of the time.
All right.
We'll have to be out of time.
Quick 5 minutes then for any questions. Yeah.
On the Abbey Road album, on the right-hand side, the first vehicle, is that a hearse?
I hadn't noticed if it is. There's a VW Beetle famously, and it's got the registration mark 28 if. And people think that that was saying that Paul would have been 28 if he'd lived, which isn't the case because he would have been 27, so that one doesn't quite work. But.
No, 27.
Go back to this. And there's a guy photo bombing that sleeve as well that wasn't supposed to be there, and he's just managed to get himself in. God, did I really do this many sleeves? Yeah.
Is that a black card?
Looks too low for a black card.
Could be a hearse, yeah, quite possibly.
It could be a black card, but the windscreen's not that big.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've never heard that one spoken of before, but it could well be. Yeah, quick question.
Why would they do it in the first place?
Again, it's telling you what's happened. It's placing the truth in plain sight. It's a very important tenet of these occultists that run these industries. Like I said, they want to give the public an opportunity to know what's gone on so that we can't make the claim that we didn't know. So as they see it, they've done no harm to us because we've gone along with it. We haven't called them out on it. By us not saying no and not raising any objection to it, we're tacitly saying yes in their mentality.
So
and that shifts the karmic burden off of them onto us.
So really it was just a trial to see how far they could go?
Well, quite possibly. I think it could have been an experiment and they didn't know which way it would go. They just wanted to see how mind controlled the general public was. Many elements of mind control in this whole thing.
Do you think it might have been possible that, just what someone said before, that it did actually retire and the Beatles were just a money-making machine that the others didn't want to end, so he was possibly put in for that reason, just to keep the whole Beatles thing going? Because if they replaced an essential band member, an original band member, with somebody else, perhaps they wouldn't have the same pull that they did have.
Yeah, that's possible. And it's possible that the original then came back at a later stage, looking at some of these photo montages. Any of these scenarios are possible, to be honest. Like I say, the only thing I can say with certainty is there's been more than one. And we've all agreed this afternoon that there's been more than one. So we're all on the same page with that, at least.
What ahead?
You've got a question.
Do you think it was quite well known or accepted amongst the music world fraternity that he wasn't the original guy? Did you think they knew it?
Well, according to Memoirs, the original version of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, he states, because Hugh Harriet writes as if he's McCartney Billy, in the first person. And so he states that the industry did know, the Rolling Stones knew, he says Elton John knew, Donovan, the musician, knew, and basically all the prominent musicians at that time knew. The general public were the last to know. And you look at the Dana Carvey thing, where he's telling the anecdote of meeting Paul McCartney and then he starts calling him Billy. It's like he knew. So it's like everyone in entertainment knows that ain't him. Did Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson, when they duetted with him, know that it wasn't Paul McCartney? Probably, yeah.
So the people that were important, that they think they're important, knew.
Yeah.
Just the plebs didn't.
Just the plebs, yeah. We're just kept in the dark, as always.
Harrison's wife called him Billy?
George Harrison's wife. In front of her son. So he's going to know as well.
There's a clip of Katy Perry on Graham Norton and Paul McCartney, and now I don't think you can find the full interview because she says, "Oh, I thought you were dead."
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's another one that's been scrubbed from YouTube,
Katy
isn't
Perry and Graham Norton with Paul McCartney.
Well, it is interesting that all this stuff is disappearing from YouTube, all these clues that you once could get and now you can't. Who's doing this? And why bother if there's nothing to it, if it's all a load of bollocks?
Who has access to be able to do that?
Well, yeah, exactly. Another good question. All right, so we'll just call it a day there, I guess.
Got a present for you.
Brace
Brace yourself. Mark, it's been wonderful having you yet again.
Is that with William
I
Shakespeare?
have a book for you.
Oh,
It's
Quest
from
of
the
Lennon.
library next door, so
Excellent.
bring it back before the 30th.
Wow. I'll bring it back when Neil brings the cable.
When Neil brings the cable back, yes. But not only that, like a notebook and pen to help with your next research project. Can I suggest, is Michael Jackson still alive? Is he
Must I?
Dave?
Dave.
I'll go with William.
Is he Dave?
Dave, yeah.
What about is Alex Jones, Bill Hicks? But there's your research.
It's 2 packs Sydney cocktails on the Caribbean island with Elvis.
So there you go, write it down.
Oh, excellent, thank you.
book he hasn't read.
There's pictures in it, isn't there?
It's an original first.